The whisper came before the prayer. "Don't worry, old man. I'll spend his money better." Frank Dalton stood frozen in front of the walnut coffin, where his son lay, the heavy scent of lilies pressing down inside the funeral home by Vancouver's harbor. Grant Hale's words slid into his ear like a cold blade, not deep enough to draw blood right away, but sharp enough to slice through any remaining illusions about human decency. Frank had not yet turned when another sound rose, faint but unmistakable, a quiet chuckle from inside the coffin. No one else reacted, only Frank and Grant. Grant's face drained of color. He stepped back half a pace, his eyes darting around as if afraid of his own shadow. Frank gripped the edge of the wood, the icy grain biting into his palm. That was Ethan's laugh. There was no mistaking it, the short, knowing laugh that used to leave Frank helpless whenever the boy beat him at chess as a child. The funeral carried on as if nothing had happened. Soft condolences drifted through the room, black fabric rustled, wooden chairs creaked. Frank stood there, dismissed by everyone, as a frail old father about to collapse under grief. No one saw that beneath the worn suit and slightly hunched shoulders was a man who had spent his entire life reading people, especially those who believed they were smarter than everyone else. Ethan Dalton, his son 34 years old, had built an $18 million logistics technology empire from nothing. The world called Ethan a prodigy, a risk-taker, the star of corporate galas. They called Frank his shadow. They didn't know that Shadow was the one who taught Ethan how to read people long before he ever read balance sheets. Chloe Dalton sat in the front row, a tissue pressed to the corner of her eye at exactly the right moments. Her grief was perfectly arranged, never too much, never too little. When guests approached to offer condolences, she looked up with red-rimmed but striking eyes, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. She wore a tailored black dress, elegant and expensive, beautiful enough to make some men look away, with a vague sense of guilt they could not explain. Grant stood a few steps away. He did not look at the coffin. His gaze clung to Chloe, tracking every small movement every time she touched her wrist, as if steadying herself. It was not the look of a friend. It was the look of possession, impatient, waiting for a prize to finally be handed over. Frank noticed everything. The way Grant's hand lingered too long on the back of Chloe's chair, the way she did not pull away. When it was time for the family to say their final goodbyes, Frank leaned down and whispered to his son, his voice meant only for himself. He apologized for not protecting Ethan. He promised the truth would not be buried with this coffin. When Frank stepped back, Chloe approached and placed a single white rose on her husband's chest. In that moment, Frank saw Ethan's hand, and his stomach tightened. It was bare. The wedding ring was gone, the simple gold band Frank had helped Ethan choose on his wedding day. The ring Ethan never removed, not even in sleep. A small detail, but Frank understood that great empires often fell because of details just like this. Grant moved close again, his face already rearranged into the calm confidence of a man who believed he had won. He saw Frank only as a broken old father with no strength left to fight. Grant did not know that Frank had once sat in boardrooms where a single nod from him could ruin or save hundreds of lives. Frank had stepped away from that power, but he had never forgotten how to use it. The sound of the laugh still echoed in his head, not as a joke, but as a message, as a challenge. Ethan never laughed when things were over. He laughed when the game had just begun. When the service ended, Frank turned and walked out of the funeral home, his step slow, his posture that of a grieving father. Inside, something had already been set in motion. He knew he had been given a new role, not the man who buried the dead, but the man who would dig up the truth. And if his son had laughed from beneath the coffin lid, then Ethan was still somewhere out there, 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Frank had only one task now to keep up with his son. The phone rang before Frank Dalton had even loosened his tie. On the other end was Chloe's voice, soft and trembling, as if her grief were being poured out, drop by carefully measured drop. Frank stood alone in the dark house, the same house where his son's laughter used to echo every Sunday night. Behind him, the photograph of Ethan on his graduation day hung slightly crooked, as if the walls themselves had lost their balance. Chloe thanked him for the funeral, said Ethan would have been proud of how beautiful everything looked. Frank did not answer right away. He listened to her breathing steady and controlled, lacking the uneven breaks of a woman who had just lost her husband. Then Chloe mentioned the lawyer, the will the company shares, and Grant Hale's name slipped into the conversation light, but heavy enough to fill the silence between them. Grant thought they should meet soon, to stabilize everything, to protect the assets, to avoid legal complications. Chloe said we, as if Frank and Grant were standing on the same side. Frank ended the call without making any promises. He poured himself a glass of whiskey 3 fingers, but did not drink it. The amber liquid caught the kitchen light, trembling slightly with his hand. Frank had seen too many people use the word stability as an excuse to take what was not theirs, and he knew that when someone rushed to talk about money, right after a death, that death was never just a tragedy. The night passed without sleep. Frank sat in the darkness, listening to every sound the house made, every creak of wood tightening in the cold. In his mind, the laugh from the coffin echoed again, no longer frightening, but sharp and deliberate. Ethan was telling him not to trust appearances, that everything was only just beginning. The next morning, Frank opened the wooden box where Ethan used to keep personal papers whenever he visited home. He was not searching for comfort, he was searching for logic. Beneath a few old notebooks and an unsent letter lay a carefully printed stack of documents, the title, Unmistakable, a formal complaint addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It was unsigned, unsent, but the contents made Frank's blood run cold. Shell companies, illegal vendor kickbacks, money moving through layered intermediaries, page after page of figures all leading back to the same name, Grant Hale. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the corporate gala months earlier, where Ethan had been publicly humiliated in front of partners and press, while Grant smiled with the confidence of a man who believed power belonged entirely to him. At the time, Frank thought it was business conflict. Now he understood Ethan had touched something he was never meant to expose. The sound of a car slowing outside snapped Frank back. He stood still and listened. The vehicle lingered too long before driving away. Someone was watching him, or watching what Ethan had left behind. Frank put on his coat, took the documents, and left the house. He went to the hospital where Ethan had been declared dead. The long corridors smelled of disinfectant white lights, draining color from every face. The doctor on duty spoke professionally about sudden cardiac arrest and work stress, but when Frank pressed further, there was a brief moment when her eyes shifted. She mentioned early rigidity, body temperature lower than expected, and that the records showed Ethan had been brought in by Grant Hale. The pieces began to fall into place without effort. Grant had been there. Grant had been in a hurry. Grant controlled the timing, the information, and now the money. If Ethan had prepared a formal complaint, then his death was the only thing that could have stopped it from being filed. Frank left the hospital slowly. Outside, Vancouver lay under a gray sky, rain drifting endlessly. He knew he was being underestimated, seen as an old father without titles or power. But it was precisely for that reason no one considered him dangerous. Standing beneath the awning, Frank unfolded the papers again. The complaint was still unsigned, unsent, as if Ethan had been waiting for the right moment, the right person. Frank folded the documents carefully, as one might safeguard a promise. He looked up at the heavy clouds moving slowly, but never standing still. In that moment, Frank understood his role was not to mourn the past. He was the one who would bring the truth into the light, even if it meant walking against the current. And somewhere, if Ethan was still alive, his son was probably smiling, not the smile of relief, but the smile of a man who knew the board had been set exactly where it needed to be. Frank Dalton knew someone was lying the moment the doctor lowered her head for just a second too long before answering. That silence was not compassion, it was hesitation. The hospital corridor stretched cold and narrow white lights spilling across the floor like thin blades. The smell of disinfectant clung to Frank's lungs, pulling him back to an old memory of an emergency room years ago, the place where he had watched his wife take her final breath. That death had been real, painful, but clear. This time everything surrounding Ethan's death felt blurred, as if hidden behind a heavy fog. Dr. Lila Chen sat across from Frank, her hands folded neatly on the desk, the posture of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. She spoke about sudden cardiac arrest, about work pressure, about rare cases that still happened. Her voice was smooth, textbook perfect, every word safe. Frank listened without interrupting his calm gaze, steady enough to make the person across from him lower her guard. Then he asked about the time of death. She answered too quickly. When he asked about Ethan's body temperature upon arrival, she slowed just half a beat. It was brief, but Frank had lived long enough to know that half a beat was all it took for a crack to appear. She said Ethan's body was colder than expected, not by much, but enough to note. She said rigor set in earlier than anticipated. She explained these things could happen in rare cases. When Frank asked who had brought Ethan into the emergency room, she looked at the computer screen, even though she clearly remembered the answer. Grant Hale. The name landed in the room like a stone. Frank did not react. He nodded, thanked her, and stood. Inside, everything had already begun to shift. Grant had not just appeared after Ethan's death. He had been there from the very beginning, standing at the intersection between life and death. As Frank walked out of the hospital, he moved slowly, not from age, but because he was arranging each piece of information in his mind. A death reported late. A body unnaturally cold. A business partner who always arrived at the right moment. An unsigned complaint left behind. These were not coincidences. They were the result of a carefully calculated chain of decisions. Frank did not go home. He drove straight to the company headquarters, where Ethan had once spent endless days and nights. The glass building rose sharply in the city center, reflecting Vancouver's gray sky, like a reminder that everything here was designed to conceal. The lobby was unnaturally quiet, stripped of the urgency that usually followed the death of a company's founder. Maya Brooks, the receptionist, looked up when she saw Frank. Surprise flickered across her face, then concern. She offered her condolences, her voice more genuine than most Frank had heard at the funeral. When he asked about Ethan's office, Maya glanced around before answering. She said Grant had ordered it sealed for legal reasons. Grant said company records needed protection. Grant said many things, and everyone seemed accustomed to obeying. Frank asked a little more gently, like a father hoping to retrieve a few personal mementos. Maya hesitated, then lowered her voice. Grant had been staying late every night since Ethan died, going through files, making late calls. Even on the day of the funeral, Grant had returned to the office as if something could not afford to wait. That sentence made Frank pause. A man who had lost his partner, attended the funeral, and still returned to his desk the same day was not driven by duty. He was driven by fear. Fear that something would disappear before he could get his hands on it. The elevator doors opened behind them. Grant stepped into the lobby, his suit immaculate, his hair perfectly styled, only the dark circles beneath his eyes betraying him. He smiled when he saw Frank, a polite smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke of grief, of Ethan's legacy, of the need for stability. When Frank mentioned the hospital, Grant's eyes darkened for a split second before he masked it. Frank did not confront him. He did not need to. He had seen enough. As he turned to leave, Frank glanced through the slightly open door of Ethan's office. Inside the safe stood open papers stacked high like a room hastily searched. Walking toward his car, Frank felt the weight of a stare on his back. Grant was watching him, or watching what he might be carrying. But Frank was no longer a man easily intimidated. His entire life had taught him how to wait, how to stay silent until the other side revealed every card in their hand. Frank sat in his car, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Ethan had left him more than a question, he had left him a mission. And Frank understood that if his son had dared to laugh from beneath the coffin lid, then this game was far from over. Frank Dalton realized he was being followed when the traffic light ahead turned green, and the car behind him did not move. Not because the driver was distracted, but because someone was watching. He drove calmly, not heading straight home instead, looping through two narrow streets near the river, where rain-soaked trees cast long shadows across the pavement. The car behind him followed as well, keeping just enough distance to avoid attention. Frank did not accelerate. He did not need to. He had learned long ago that the impatient were usually the first to lose. Eventually, the car disappeared when Frank turned into a crowded public parking lot. He remained seated for several minutes, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his heartbeat steady but heavy. Someone wanted to know what he had discovered, and that alone confirmed he was on the right path. That evening, Frank reopened the stack of papers Ethan had left behind this time, reading not as a grieving father, but as a man who had once sat at tables where real decisions were made. The financial language was unmistakable. Shell companies spread across multiple jurisdictions, inflated vendor contracts, carefully rotated kickbacks. Ethan had not merely suspected wrongdoing, he had proven it. And if this complaint were ever filed, it would not only drag Grant down, it would pull far larger names into the light. Frank understood why Ethan had stayed silent, and he understood why his son had needed to disappear. The phone vibrated again. This time, it was not Chloe. An unknown number. Frank answered. The voice on the other end was male, low-controlled, and cold. Mr. Dalton, perhaps it would be best for you to let this end here for your own good. Frank did not respond immediately. He looked out the window as rain tapped steadily against the glass, each drop keeping time. Then he spoke slowly, his voice calm in a way that surprised even himself. I have already lost my son. What do you think is left that can frighten me? The call ended. No further threats, no explanations. But Frank knew this was no longer a one-on-one game. An entire network had begun to take notice of him. The next morning, Frank returned to the company building, this time not alone. He carried an old leather briefcase he had not used in years. Inside were not Ethan's documents, but old notes, business cards, and phone numbers from a time when Frank had built power and then walked away from it. Maya Brooks spotted him from across the lobby, concern and relief crossing her face. She guided him into a quiet corner, away from the cameras. Her voice shook as she explained that 2 employees had been terminated shortly after Ethan began questioning vendor contracts. They had wanted to speak out, but they were threatened, isolated, silenced. Frank listened without making promises, yet something in his gaze made Maya feel for the first time that she was not alone. The office door swung open. Grant Hale appeared fast and deliberate, as if he had been waiting. He asked what Frank was doing there, his tone polite but sharp. Frank turned to face him for the first time, not avoiding his eyes. In that brief moment, Grant realized he had misjudged the man standing before him. Frank did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He said only one sentence low enough that only Grant could hear it. You should be worried about what Ethan sent out before he died, because I believe some of it was never kept in this office." Grant froze. For a split second, the confident mask cracked. Then he smiled a tight smile of a man scrambling to regain control. "We will handle this legally, Mr. Dalton." Frank nodded. "I am counting on it." As Frank left the building, he knew he had touched Grant's true weakness. Not money, not the company, but the fear of exposure under the full light of the law. That night, Frank stood alone in his living room, warm light falling over old family photographs. He paused before a picture of Ethan as a child standing beside him, holding a chess piece, that familiar clever smile on his face. Frank placed his hand against the frame, feeling the thin layer of dust. "You are 3 moves ahead of me, Ethan," he whispered. "But I am still on the board." Outside the city drowned in rain and darkness. Somewhere the people who believed they controlled everything were beginning to feel uneasy. And Frank Dalton, the man everyone underestimated, was the one holding the card that could shake the entire game. Frank Dalton returned to the funeral home on a rain-heavy afternoon when the parking lot was nearly empty and the wreaths had begun to wilt. The glass doors opened, carrying with them the scent of soaked flowers and a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Harold Pierce, the funeral director, greeted Frank with a professional smile, shaped by years of standing face-to-face with death. He said Ethan had been prepared with great care, that the service had been dignified and beautiful. Frank nodded, allowing the man to lead him down a narrow hallway, where pale yellow lights washed over walls lined with memorial photographs. Frank did not ask about rituals. He asked about details about the body temperature at the time of transfer, about personal effects. Harold flipped through the file, his finger lingering just a moment too long on one page. He said Ethan's body had been colder than normal when they received it, as if it had come straight from refrigeration. He said that was unusual. Then Frank asked about the wedding ring. Harold looked up, his eyes uneasy. There was no ring listed in the intake report. Normally, jewelry remained with the deceased, unless the family requested otherwise. Family. The word hovered between them. Frank did not need to ask more. The answer was already there. Someone had taken the ring, not for sentiment, but for value, or for what it unlocked. Frank left the funeral home with a familiar weight in his chest, the feeling that came when suspicions began lining up neatly. He did not go home. He drove slowly through the streets near Chloe's apartment, darkness settling, early streetlights reflecting off wet pavement like shattered glass. Chloe's car was parked outside a small cafe, warm yellow light glowing inside in sharp contrast to the rain. Frank stopped across the street, leaving the engine running. He watched Chloe step outside, lightly dressed, nothing about her, suggesting a widow who had just buried her husband. Then Grant Hale emerged from the cafe, holding an umbrella over her, his hand resting on her back with practiced ease. In that moment, Frank felt no shock, only confirmation. They stood close, speaking quickly and softly, like people sharing a plan rather than grief. Grant handed Chloe a thin envelope. She accepted it without hesitation. When they parted, Chloe glanced up and down the street, her eyes alert. Frank lowered his head, letting the darkness do its work. On the drive home, Frank's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "You are going too far. Stop now." No signature, no explanation. Frank deleted it as soon as he read it. He did not need further proof of what he already knew. The people behind Grant were beginning to grow nervous. That night, Frank sat in his living room, the lamp casting light over Ethan's files. He turned each page this time, not just reading, but annotating. Connections, shell companies, rotating streams of money. And threaded through it all, Chloe's name appeared more often than he had expected, not as a victim, but as someone who knew and stayed silent. Frank thought back to Chloe's expression at the funeral, her grief precisely measured. Now he understood why. She had not been mourning Ethan. She had been mourning the end of a performance. Near midnight, Frank rose and opened an old drawer where he kept things rarely used. A second phone, an old contact list, names of people who owed him favors from a life he had once lived. He did not make any calls yet. He simply arranged everything like a chess player patiently returning pieces to the board. Outside the window, rain continued to fall. Somewhere in the city, Chloe was holding Ethan's wedding ring, or had already handed it to Grant. A small object, but enough to open a door they believed was tightly locked. Frank set the file aside and leaned back in his chair. He no longer doubted. Ethan had left behind more than evidence. His son had left a path. Step by step, Frank was following it. Across the city, the people who believed everything was under their control were beginning to make mistakes. They were moving too fast, and Frank Dalton, the man everyone considered the weakest piece on the board, was the one who could now see the entire game unfolding in front of him. The truth was not spoken through tears, but through a sentence so dry it was cruel. I slept with Grant. Frank Dalton stood at the doorway of Chloe's apartment, his hand still resting on the doorbell, as if letting go might allow him to turn away and let everything remain buried beneath polite lies. But that sentence sealed every exit. It hung between them like a heavy iron curtain dropping without warning. The apartment glowed with warm yellow light, the smell of cold coffee mixing with Chloe's familiar perfume, creating a false sense of ordinary life. Chloe stood there with her hair neatly tied back, her face tired but not panicked. There was no trace of a woman who had just lost her husband, only the tension of someone who knew her performance was nearing its end. Frank did not explode in anger. He stepped inside quietly and closed the door behind him. He had come too far to waste energy on emotion now. Chloe continued, her voice steady, as if reciting a story she had rehearsed many times. The affair with Grant began as Ethan grew distant. Late nights, unexplained calls, long silences. Grant was there listening, comforting, promising. Chloe said she had been weak, said she had been lonely. But when she looked at Frank, there was no remorse in her eyes, only a weary calculation. Then Chloe spoke about Ethan, about how he had changed in his final months, sleeping in his office, taking sudden trips without explanation, renting a storage unit under a different name. She admitted she had followed her husband, hired someone to watch him, and what she discovered frightened and angered her at the same time. Ethan was not just suspicious, he was preparing to walk away from everything. Frank listened as each detail struck like another hammer blow, driving the picture deeper into place. Chloe opened a drawer, pulled out a thin envelope, and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of documents Ethan had prepared, divorce papers, not a quiet settlement, but a fault-based divorce supported by evidence of infidelity and legal notes strong enough to destroy Chloe's reputation and drag Grant into court. Chloe let out a hollow laugh. She said Ethan had known everything about her and Grant, about the dirty money. He had not shouted or confronted them. He had simply prepared to disappear, or prepared to burn everything down through the law. A chill ran up Frank's spine. This was no longer the story of a cheating wife. This was a calculated war. Ethan had never intended to spare anyone, and perhaps that was why he had become a threat that needed to be removed. Chloe continued, her voice dropping. The night Ethan died, she had been with Grant. She said it like armor and alibi. But Frank heard the fear beneath it. She did not know exactly what had happened to Ethan. She only knew Grant told her to stay silent, said everything would be fine, said Ethan had brought this fate on himself. Frank stood. For the first time since entering the apartment, he looked directly at Chloe, not as Ethan's father, but as a man who had once stood at the peak of power games. He spoke slowly, every word deliberate. My son did not bring his own death upon himself. He was setting a trap, and you and Grant walked straight into it. Chloe went pale. For a brief moment, her controlled exterior cracked, revealing real panic. She asked where Ethan was. She asked if Frank knew. Frank did not answer. He did not need to. His silence was enough for Chloe to understand that whether Ethan was alive or dead, he was still in control. Frank turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused and spoke one final sentence, not loudly, not as a threat. If you have even a shred of conscience left, remember this: the law does not show mercy to those who know the truth and choose silence. The door closed behind him. In the hallway, the cold fluorescent light stretched Frank's shadow along the floor. He walked slowly, but with certainty. Everything was clearer now. Ethan had not only left evidence, he had left a plan, and the traitors were beginning to realize they no longer controlled the story. Frank stepped out into the night air. The cold cut into his lungs, yet his mind felt sharper than ever. The game had entered a new phase, and this time, the pieces everyone believed were weakest were beginning to reveal their true power. The metal storage door screeched open, the sound sharp and unwilling, as if the place itself did not want to be disturbed. Inside was not darkness, but raw truth, waiting to be seen. Frank Dalton stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the cold fluorescent lights hanging from the ceiling. The smell of metal old paper and machine oil blended into a heavy atmosphere, like a room burdened with too many secrets. This was the unit Ethan had rented under another name, the place where his son had prepared a move that required patience no one else possessed. Corkboards covered the walls, photographs, diagrams, and handwritten notes connected by red strings that formed a suffocating web. Frank stepped closer. At the center was the name Grant Hale, circled in thick marker surrounded by shell companies, intermediary accounts, inflated vendor contracts. Everything Ethan had suspected was here, proven piece by piece, with cold precision. On a small wooden table lay thick folders carefully organized. Frank opened one at random. Ethan's handwriting stared back at him painfully, familiar, neat and sharp, stripped of emotion. Ethan had not acted like a betrayed husband. He had acted like a strategist confronting an entire system. In the corner of the unit, a small refrigerator hummed softly, steady and out of place. Frank approached it, his hand hesitating as it touched the icy metal door. Inside were labeled vials and a handwritten instruction sheet. Temporary paralysis agent, mimics cardiac arrest symptoms, short duration, full recovery. Frank closed his eyes, his chest tightening as the impossible truth settled in. Ethan had not died. His son had turned himself into a corpse to see who would rush in to steal what remained. A faint electronic beep sounded overhead. Frank looked up. A small red light blinked. A camera. Ethan had not only left evidence, he had left eyes. Before Frank could react, another sound echoed behind him, footsteps slow and deliberate. He turned to see Grant Hale standing in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the concrete floor. The expensive suit was rumpled, the tie crooked, the familiar confidence gone from his face. In Grant's hand was a gun, its barrel aimed directly at Frank's chest. "Hello, Mr. Dalton," Grant said, his voice low and cold. "I wondered how long it would take you to find this place." Frank did not step back. He did not raise his hands. He simply met Grant's gaze, calm to the point of being terrifying. "So you know?" Grant gave a thin smile. "Of course I know. Your son is very smart, but smart does not mean immortal." Grant stepped inside the metal door closing behind him. "I found this place days before you did. I just needed to make sure you would lead me to the next step." Frank understood immediately. Grant did not just want the evidence. He wanted Ethan to know where he was, to reclaim what Ethan had taken. "You will not find it," Frank said slowly. Grant tilted his head. "You mean the money?" "Believe me, I will find it. And when I do, I will make sure your son never gets the chance to come back." The air inside the unit froze. Frank felt his heartbeat steady and clear. He had lived long enough to know fear was a luxury in moments like this. He spoke quietly but firmly. Ethan planned for this, and you are standing exactly where he wanted you to stand. Grant tightened his grip on the gun. You think I am afraid? I have gone too far to turn back now. At that moment, Grant's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his face drained of color. The message was short. The storage unit is compromised. Move to the backup location. The package is secure. Grant looked up, his eyes darting around the unit, as if only now realizing the walls might be watching him. Frank followed his gaze to the ceiling. The red light blinked steadily, patiently. He is watching us, Frank said. And you just walked into the trap he built. Grant let out a harsh laugh, but it carried no weight. Then we end this right here. The click of the gun's trigger echoed dry and sharp. Frank did not close his eyes. He thought of Ethan, of that mischievous smile from years ago, of the chess game left unfinished. And he understood that even with a gun pointed at him, the real power in that moment was not in the hand holding the weapon. It belonged to the man who had turned death itself into a chess piece. A voice came out of the darkness behind Frank, calm enough to make the gun in Grant's hand waver for a split second. Put the gun down, Grant. This is over. Ethan stepped out from the narrow space between the metal shelves, the fluorescent light sharpening his face, thinner now harder, but his eyes clear and cold with control. Not a ghost, not a hallucination. Frank's son alive, standing firm, owning the room. Grant spun around his mouth, opening in a sharp gasp, like a man staring straight at fear, given human form. Frank did not turn right away. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the moment pass through him. Not relief, but a heavy, grounded calm, the kind that only comes when the final pieces fall into place. When he opened his eyes, Ethan stood beside him, close enough for Frank to feel his breath, the familiar scent of metal and dust clinging to his clothes. Grant stammered, then laughed, a twisted sound from a man trying to claw back control. You were supposed to be dead. Ethan tilted his head, his voice even. I was dead in the way you needed me to be. Long enough for you to believe you had won. Long enough for you to show everything. Grant shook his head, the gun swinging back toward Frank. Nice trick, but you think I came here unprepared. Ethan did not move. He raised one hand, not in surrender, but pointing toward the ceiling. The small red light blinked steadily, patient, unblinking. Every step you took, every word you said has been recorded. Ethan continued, his voice, never rising, never softening, each sentence landing with precision. Your calls with Chloe, your deals with vendors, the money moving through shell companies, even the plan to make my death look natural. It has all been sent out not just to my lawyer, but to federal investigators and the Securities Commission. Grant froze. The color drained from his face like a receding tide. You think they will believe you? Ethan smiled without warmth. They already do. They are just waiting for you to say the rest yourself. And you just did in front of my father on camera and on an open line. Frank saw it then clearly in Grant's eyes. No calculation left. Only panic. Grant stepped back, then another. You thought I was weak, Frank said, his voice low and steady. But my son was not. He always knew who would come to steal from a corpse first. Grant snarled and lifted the gun, but Ethan moved fast and decisive. The shot rang out, the bullet grazing Frank's shoulder, burning hot. Frank went down, but before he hit the ground, Ethan was already on Grant. They crashed across the concrete floor, breath-harsh bodies colliding, the gun skidding away into the shadows. Frank pushed himself up his shoulder, screaming, his mind clear. He kicked the gun farther away, out of reach. Ethan pinned Grant, his voice dropping raw for the first time. You planned to kill my father. You thought about it. Grant spat a broken laugh blood at his lip. I thought about both of you. Then came the sound that felt like release. Sirens distant at first, then closer more than one. Ethan looked up at Frank. It is over, Dad. Frank nodded, eyes burning not from pain, but from a moment he had waited for far too long. The storage door burst open. Red and blue light flooded in, splitting the darkness apart. Voices shouted commands. Grant was dragged away, screaming threats that faded as the cuffs snapped shut. Frank was helped to his feet, his shoulder quickly bandaged. Ethan stood beside him, a hand firm and warm against his back. When the noise settled, Ethan took one last look around the unit. The corkboards, the red strings, the evidence that had done its job. He turned to Frank, his voice softer. I did not tell you because I knew you would never let me do this. Frank exhaled and cupped his son's face, the gesture holding both reproach and pride. Maybe. But you did one thing right. You did not stand alone. Outside, the Vancouver night still held rain, but for the first time since the funeral, Frank felt the sky beginning to open. The game was not finished, but the man who thought he held all the power had been exposed, and the family everyone underestimated was the one rewriting the rules. The interrogation room was so quiet that even the ticking of the wall clock felt painfully loud. Chloe looked up when the door opened, the familiar confidence gone from her eyes, replaced by exhaustion mixed with fear. Frank Dalton stood behind the one-way glass, not part of the questioning, yet every word, every glance, reached him clearly. Ethan sat beside him, his shoulder neatly bandaged, his expression so composed that it made the investigators look at him differently. He was no longer a victim, no longer a man who had been deceived. In this moment, Ethan was the one controlling the narrative. Chloe began with tears. She said she had been used. She said Grant had manipulated her, that she was only a lonely wife, pulled in by sweet promises. But when the investigators placed recordings, transfer records and emails sent from her own personal account on the table, her defense began to crack. Chloe stayed silent far too long for someone innocent. Frank watched, his heart no longer aching the way he once thought it would. What remained was a deep, steady sadness. He had once treated Chloe like a daughter. He had believed she would protect Ethan when he could not. Now that image collapsed piece by piece, quietly, without drama, but completely. Ethan stood and asked the investigators for a few minutes alone with Chloe. They agreed. The door closed, leaving only the two people who had once been husband and wife. Chloe looked at Ethan as if he were a stranger. She asked how far he intended to go. Ethan answered simply, to the very end. He said he had not done this for revenge. He had done it because there had been no other choice. Grant had planned to kill him not once, not impulsively, but step by step, cold and systematic. And Chloe had known. She had chosen silence. Chloe broke down this time, perhaps genuinely. She said she was afraid of losing everything, afraid of Grant, afraid of the truth. Ethan listened, but his eyes did not waver. Some betrayals could not be washed away with tears. When Ethan left the room, Chloe collapsed forward onto the table. She knew it was over, but in that moment, another thought sparked in her mind. If she could not save herself with words, she would erase the evidence. If everything disappeared, maybe there was still a way out. Frank did not hear that thought, but he sensed something shift. When Chloe lifted her head, her eyes suddenly sharp, no longer desperate, but resolved. A person pushed to the edge either surrenders or destroys everything. That night, Ethan and Frank returned to the safe apartment Ethan had prepared in advance, small and simple, without any sign of wealth. Frank sat down, allowing his body to finally relax for the first time since the funeral. Ethan made coffee, the familiar motion echoing their life together years ago. Two men, two generations sitting across from each other under dim light. Frank asked the question he had been carrying for a long time. "Why did you not tell me from the beginning?" Ethan answered slowly, because he knew Frank would try to stop him, and if that happened, Grant would move first. Ethan admitted he had gambled everything, even his own life, but he believed one thing above all else, that his father would understand. Frank looked at his son, with eyes filled with both pride and pain. He had always thought he could protect Ethan from everything, but in the end, it was Ethan who had protected him. Ethan's phone vibrated. A message appeared, only a single line. "I know you are alive. If you do not meet me in 1 hour, I will burn everything down." It was from Chloe. The air in the room thickened instantly. Frank stood up. She has lost her mind. Ethan reread the message, his face darkening. Chloe was no longer just desperate, she was ready to drag everyone into hell with her. Ethan opened a drawer and pulled out a thick stack of documents, the evidence he had hidden at the old house. If it was destroyed, Grant could escape the most serious charges. Chloe knew that, and she was using it as leverage. Frank placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We are not letting her do this." Ethan nodded. He had prepared for this scenario. One final plan, more dangerous but necessary. Outside the city sank into darkness. Somewhere Chloe was preparing for the most desperate act of her life. And Ethan knew the game was not over. It had only entered its final move, where there was no room for mistakes. The house went up in flames after a single flick of a lighter so fast that no one had time to scream. Fire crawled across the curtains like a starving creature, then swallowed the room that had once been a symbol of manufactured happiness. Ethan stepped into the living room and immediately smelled gasoline, the sharp, unmistakable scent cutting into his lungs like a belated warning. Chloe stood at the center of the room, one hand gripping a lighter, the other holding an empty plastic can, her eyes burning not from the fire, but from madness that had crossed beyond fear. Frank stood just behind his son, his heart pounding, but his mind unnaturally clear. He had faced rooms full of conspiracies before, had watched people lose everything with a single signature. But this was different. This was not a power game. This was pure desperation. Chloe laughed, the sound brittle and broken. She said that if no one could win, then everyone would lose. If the evidence disappeared, if the house burned to the ground, there would be nothing left to convict her. Grant would stay silent. She would stay silent. Everything would end in ashes. Ethan stepped forward, raising his hand, his voice low and measured. "Chloe, stop." She looked at him, eyes red and torn. She said he had destroyed her life first with his plan, with his fake death, with turning her into a joke and a criminal at the same time. Frank watched them both and understood something painful. Chloe was not just afraid of prison. She was afraid of being seen for who she truly was, afraid of the naked truth that she had chosen, wrong loved, wrong betrayed the wrong man. Ethan spoke again, not to argue, but to reach the last piece of her that might still remain. He said he had not come back to destroy her. He had come back to end the cycle of lies. If she burned this house down, she would not erase the truth, only prove that every accusation was correct. The fire spread quickly, black smoke rolling across the ceiling. Frank coughed, his eyes burning. He glanced around and spotted the bookshelf where Ethan had once hidden the safe. The evidence was already gone, secured in the bag Frank was carrying. Chloe did not know that. She believed fire was her only escape. Sirens sounded in the distance. Ethan had silently activated the emergency line the moment they entered the house. Chloe realized it as the sirens grew louder, her face twisting with rage. She raised the lighter, high, her hand shaking. Frank moved before Ethan could speak again. He lunged forward, not fast, but decisive, grabbing Chloe's wrist. The lighter hit the floor, sparks catching the carpet. Ethan pulled Frank back, and they both fell as flames surged behind them. Chloe screamed not in pain, but in the realization that she had truly lost. Every door was closed. She staggered toward the stairs, but thick smoke sent her reeling. The front door was blocked by fire. The back door had collapsed. Firefighters burst through the entrance, cutting through the smoke. Frank and Ethan were dragged outside, coughing shaken, but alive. Frank turned back and saw Chloe being carried out on a stretcher unconscious from smoke inhalation, still breathing, still alive to face the consequences. Ethan sat on the lawn, his hands trembling as the adrenaline faded. Frank sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. This time, he said nothing. No words were needed. When the fire was finally contained, the house stood as a scorched shell. Everything that had represented money status and hollow promises had turned to ash. Frank looked at it and understood that it was not the house that had been destroyed, but the last remaining mask. That night, under flashing red and blue lights, Ethan stood straight and answered every police question with complete calm. Frank stood behind him, quiet, but no longer underestimated. The people there looked at him differently now, like a man who had walked through fire and kept the steel core inside intact. As the ambulance pulled away, Frank looked at his son, his voice hoarse. "You did everything you could." Ethan shook his head. "No, Dad. We did it together." The flames were gone, but the truth was not. And from the ashes, something cleaner and more honest was beginning to take shape. The morning news spoke a familiar name, then fell silent in the small kitchen. Frank Dalton turned off the radio with a decisive motion, as if one more word might be enough to disturb the fragile calm that had finally settled. Grant Hale had been charged. Chloe was in custody. The headlines were short and cold, unable to capture the long nights, the precise decisions the fears swallowed, so they would not slow a single step. The truth now stood on its own, unadorned, without excuses. Ethan sat at the table with a thick stack of paperwork in front of him. Not contracts, not financial reports, but a petition for legal restoration. His name, his date of birth, the traces of a man once officially declared dead. Each line felt like a slow, steady breath, as if he were pulling himself back into the world, piece by piece. Frank made coffee with familiar movements, his hands steady. He watched his son, the shoulders that had carried an entire trap, an entire chessboard calculated in lives. He did not ask if Ethan was tired. He already knew. The days that followed moved in a strange rhythm. No more chases, no more hiding. Only meetings with lawyers, sessions with investigators. The same questions repeated until every gap was sealed. Ethan answered everything calm, precise, without embellishment. He did not need to cast himself as a hero. The truth was heavy enough on its own. Frank sat beside him, quiet, but no longer invisible. When questions turned to old connections and past decisions, Frank answered in a low, steady voice. He had stepped away from the world of power once, but he had never forgotten how it worked. The people in the room slowly shifted their gaze. The underestimated old man was not just a grieving father. He was a witness who understood the game. One afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against the window, Ethan signed the final page. He looked up and exhaled as if setting down an invisible weight. Frank placed a hand on his son's shoulder and said nothing. In moments like this, silence was the highest form of acknowledgement. News of the case spread, then faded. The world has its own way of forgetting tragedies once they are no longer urgent. But for Frank and Ethan, nothing returned to what it had been, and neither of them wanted it to. Ethan suggested selling what remained of the old company, not out of fear, but because he did not want to build a future on a rotted foundation. Frank did not object. Some places complete their purpose even when the cost is too high. They moved into a smaller office filled with natural light, no grand signage. Ethan began sketching a new direction: security consulting fraud, prevention, protecting people who do not realize they are being betrayed until it is too late. Frank listened, then nodded, not as a father granting permission, but as a partner who understood the value of experience. One evening, Frank sat alone on the porch, a cool breeze moving through the trees. His shoulder had healed, leaving only a thin scar. Not painful, just a reminder. His phone vibrated. A short message from an investigator. Grant would receive a severe sentence. No loopholes left. Frank read it, feeling neither joy nor sorrow, only the sense of a circle closing. Ethan stepped outside with 2 glasses of water. They sat side by side, without needing to look at each other. Frank thought of the days he had believed his son was gone, of the coffin, of the laughter no one else had heard. It all felt like a long dream, now leaving echoes rather than images. "Do you regret it?" Frank asked softly. Ethan was silent for a moment, then shook his head. "I only regret not trusting sooner that I did not have to do it alone." Frank smiled, tired but real. "Family is not a place without danger," he said. "It is a place where no one has to stand alone against it." The sky darkened. Lights came on inside the house. No more secrets, no more codes. Just time moving forward, steady back in its rightful rhythm. The chess game was nearly finished, but the story was not. And in that quiet, Frank understood that real power was not about controlling others, but about protecting what mattered most, even when the entire world believed you had already lost. The verdict was delivered on what seemed like an ordinary morning, but a single sentence in the courtroom brought the entire game to an end. Grant Hale lowered his head as the judge read a sentence so long there was no room left for hope, while Chloe sat motionless, as if she had finally understood that no performance could save her from the consequences. Frank Dalton stood in the last row, his back straight, one hand resting lightly on the bench. He did not look at Grant, nor at Chloe. He looked at Ethan. His son stood beside his lawyer, his face calm, his eyes deep and steady. Not the eyes of a victor, but of a man who had walked the path he had to walk. When the gavel came down, the room did not erupt the way people imagine. It deflated quietly, like a space finally opened after a long, suffocating stretch. Frank exhaled slowly. He felt no triumph, only the sense of a circle closing where it should. Outside the courthouse steps, a light wind moved through the air. Reporters stood scattered, a few cameras pointed toward Ethan. He paused and answered briefly, no boasting, no self-praise. He said the truth had come out, and that was what mattered. Frank stood behind him, not in the frame, but anyone paying attention could tell he was the silent pillar behind the entire story. On the drive home, father and son spoke very little. The city slid past the windows, familiar, yet changed. Frank thought of the funeral day, of the coffin, of the laughter no one else had heard. It all felt like a thin fog that had finally lifted, leaving the world painfully clear. Weeks later, the new office officially opened. No banners, no celebration. Just a small sign with a simple name. Ethan threw himself into the work, each meeting, each case file. Frank sat across from him, reading slowly, asking careful questions, offering measured advice. None of their early clients knew that the gray-haired man at the desk had once been dismissed as the weakest piece on the board. They only knew that when he spoke, things became clear. One late afternoon, Ethan brought a woman into the office. She was tall, her gaze calm, her voice precise, a forensic financial specialist who had worked on the case from the beginning. Frank shook her hand and felt sincerity without ornament. When she left, Ethan lingered, slightly awkward. Frank smiled. After deep betrayal, daring to trust again was another kind of courage. That evening, Frank sat on the porch watching the sky change color. The clock inside the house chimed steadily. No more irregular rhythms, no more codes. Time had returned to its proper role. Ethan brought out 2 cups of tea and sat beside him. They did not talk about the case. They talked about small things, about a garden that needed trimming, about a trip they might take once everything settled. Frank realized then that real power is quiet. It does not need closed-door meetings or bright stage lights. It lives in the ability to stand firm when everything collapses, and in the choice to protect the people you love, even when the cost is being misunderstood, isolated, or underestimated by the entire world. Ethan turned to his father and said he once thought he had to disappear to save everyone. Frank shook his head. No, you only needed to trust that you did not have to do it alone. Family is where you return, not where you prove anything. Night fell. The city grew still. No more pursuit. No more hiding. Just 2 people who had walked through fire and knew who they were once the ashes settled. Their story did not end with victory, but with the quiet peace that comes from facing the truth. If you have stayed with this story until the very end, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, where you are watching from, and what moment stayed with you the most. If this story gave you something to reflect on, tap like and follow so you do not miss the journeys ahead. Sometimes a story is not just meant to be heard, but to remind us that even when underestimated, a person can still rewrite the rules of their own life.